Objective. After listening to this module, you'll be able to describe components of an effective goal for a health education lesson. Lesson planning goals.
If I were to give you instructions to get to San Diego from Alta Loma, I could tell you to go down the 15 freeway, or I could tell you to go down the 57 to the 5 freeway. Either way, you're going to get to San Diego. In other words, there's more than one way to get there. The most important thing is that you get there. I'm going to go through components of a lesson plan, which is a blueprint or a roadmap to get to an end result. These components may or may not be the same components that you've been taught in your other education classes. Just like getting to San Diego, there may be more than one way to get there. It doesn't matter how you get there or the lesson plan format you follow, as long as you get there or as long as the objectives are accomplished. It's okay to have different lesson plan formats as long as you have some plan to accomplish your objectives. There are 8 components to an effective lesson plan that I'd like to discuss. 1, the overall goal and objectives. 2, an anticipatory set. 3, direct instruction or learning activities. 4, guided practice. 5, closure. 6, independent practice. 7, materials. And 8, assessment. An effective overall goal specifically for a health education lesson plan: 1 is usually purely behaviorally based. 2 is very short and to the point. 3 includes only one goal. 4 is general but not too general. 5 does not include vague words such as more. And 6 usually begins with, ultimately, I want my students to. An overall health objective is usually behaviorally based. Because knowledge alone does not affect our health, the overall goal of a health lesson plan should be behaviorally oriented. Knowing that you should eat more vegetables in and of itself does nothing for your health. Actually eating more vegetables is what improves your health. Knowing the benefits of exercise does nothing for your fitness level. Actually exercising is what improves your fitness level. Knowledge may be an important precursor to making those changes, but the overall goal is what you ultimately want your students to do. It's the overall end result that you want to see in your students. Students will eat more fruits and vegetables, or students will increase their physical activity levels, or students will wear their seatbelts. What is the end result that you'd like to see in your students? What health behaviors do you want to see them adopt? Or it could be that you want your students to refrain or abstain from engaging in unhealthy behavior. Ultimately, I want my students to refrain from smoking. Or, ultimately, I want my students to refrain from using illicit drugs. These are completely appropriate because they're still behaviorally oriented. They pertain to a behavior, even if it's a behavior in which you don't want them to engage. Which is the best example of an overall goal? Students will understand the importance of being physically active, or students will become physically active. Students will become physically active is the better overall goal because it's a behaviorally based statement. Sure, you want your students to understand the importance of being physically active, but you ultimately want them to actually become physically active. The overall goal is what you ultimately want them to do. Understanding something doesn't usually improve your health. It's actually doing something. Which of these two is the best example of an overall goal? Students will be able to identify the different food groups that make up the food guide pyramid. Or students will eat according to recommendations of the food guide pyramid. The best overall goal is students will eat according to recommendations of the food guide pyramid because you're stating that you want your students to do something, to engage in a behavior that will improve their health. Identifying the different food groups is good, and maybe that would be a good objective, but again, for the overall goal, you need to decide what you ultimately want your students to do. What behavior do you ultimately want them to adopt as a result of your lesson? Short as possible, an overall goal is meant to be short, sweet, and simple. Get to the point as fast as possible. A wordy, long-winded overall goal does not make it better. Use as few words as possible. Which of these two is the best example of an overall goal? Ultimately, I want my students to engage in physical activity on a regular and consistent basis in order to improve their cardiovascular fitness. Or, ultimately, I want my students to exercise on a regular and consistent basis. Ultimately, I want my students to exercise on a regular and consistent basis. You could even simply say, ultimately, I want my students to exercise. Which of these two is the best example of an overall goal? Ultimately, I want my students to engage in a variety of stress management methods in order to effectively manage stress that occur on a daily basis. Or, ultimately, I want my students to effectively manage stress. Ultimately, I want my students to effectively manage stress. This statement basically says the same thing that the first longer statement says, but it's stated more concisely. Include one goal. An overall goal usually includes only one goal. You can have multiple objectives that help reach that goal, but an effective overall goal for a health lesson plan includes only one goal. An effective overall goal almost never includes the word and. An example of an overall goal in which and is not appropriate is, ultimately, I want my students to exercise and eat less fast food. Because exercise and nutrition are completely different health topics, these should be two completely different overall goals for two completely different lesson plans. Another inappropriate overall goal is, ultimately, I want my students to manage their stress and refrain from smoking. Stress management and tobacco are two completely different health topics and should be two completely different overall goals. Which of these two is the best example of an overall goal? Ultimately, I want my students to eat vegetables and exercise, or ultimately, I want my students to refrain from using illicit drugs. Ultimately, I want my students to refrain from using illicit drugs. General, but not too general. An overall goal is a general, broad statement, but it's a general, broad statement that pertains to a specific health behavior. Which of these two is the best example of an overall goal? Ultimately, students will take care of their mental health. Or, ultimately, students will effectively manage their stress. Ultimately, students will effectively manage their stress is the better overall goal. Mental health is very broad. Your lesson plan would have to be extremely long to cover anything and everything that affects mental health. Effectively managing stress affects our mental health, but it pertains to a specific health topic, stress management. Which of these two is the best example of an overall goal? Ultimately, I want my students to be healthy. Or, ultimately, I want my students to eat more fruits. Ultimately, I want my students to eat more fruits. Wanting your students to be more healthy is way too general. Tons of things can affect your health. Seatbelt use, exercise, eating fruits and vegetables, managing your stress, using drugs, etc., etc., etc. It's way too general. Your objectives should accomplish your goal, so you'd have to have a gazillion objectives in order to completely reach your goal of having your students be healthier. So ultimately, I want my students to eat fruits pertains to a specific health behavior and is a completely appropriate overall goal. Does not include vague words such as more. You have to be careful of saying, ultimately, I want my students to eat more vegetables, because you're assuming that all of your students don't eat enough vegetables. It could be that a couple of your students actually do eat enough vegetables. So the overall goal of ultimately, I want my students to eat vegetables would cover everyone, even those who already eat enough vegetables. By saying more, you make an assumption that could be completely inaccurate. So it's best to stay away from including the word more in your overall goal.
Key points. An effective overall goal indicates the end result, or what you ultimately want your students to do. It is usually purely behaviorally based, very short, includes only one goal, is general but not too general, does not include vague words, and usually begins with, ultimately, I want my students to. And that's it.